Scope. A framework scope provides the set of general questions about the policy process that it helps the analyst to answer. ACF's traditional scope involves questions relating to coalitions, learning, and policy change. The framework is most useful for understanding these topics in high conflict situations at the subsystem level of analysis. Figure 4.1 from the text, also known as the flow diagram of the Advocacy Coalition Framework. In this slide, we will review the diagram of the ACF. This diagram is how we can observe the flow of the framework and apply it to policy process. The policy subsystem is represented by the rectangle on the right, illustrating a case with two competing coalitions representing their actors' beliefs and resources. These coalitions utilize strategies to influence decisions by government authorities that affect institutional rules, policy outputs, and policy outcomes. These decisions then feed back into the policy subsystem, but can also affect external subsystems affairs. Theoretical emphasis. One of the central objectives of the ACF is to contribute to the understanding of policy change and stability. This focus is important because policy's level of stability varies. ACF focuses more on directional policy evaluation and assumes that policies and programs are transitions of policy-oriented beliefs and distinguishes between major and minor policy change. Four conceptual pathways to policy change. The four conceptual pathways to policy change are external source, internal events, policy-oriented learning, and negotiated agreement. All of these can be merged into one hypothesis. External source are events that the actors in the subsystem cannot control. This pathway and the events included increase the likelihood of major policy change. Internal events are something that happens within the subsystem itself. This pathway is more likely affected by subsystem actors and results in major policy change. Policy-oriented learning is a form of minor, not major, policy change. This pathway is more of a natural system and is more conducive to policy change. This change usually happens over a longer period of time. The negotiated agreement is the final pathway. In this pathway, previously adverse coalitions come to an agreement, resulting in a more substantial change in governmental programs. Of the 9 forms of negotiated agreement, hurting stalemate is the most important condition instigating negotiations. This occurs when warring coalitions perceive the status quo as unacceptable and do not have access to alternative venues for achieving their objectives. ACF hypothesis. The authors summarize the review of ACF by offering 2 hypotheses of policy change focusing on the external perturbations and power shifts. Yet Wiebel and Norstead merged the 4 pathways to a single hypothesis. Hypothesis 1. The 4 pathways to policy change, or a mix of the 4, is a necessary but not sufficient source of change in the policy core attributes of a governmental problem. Hypothesis 2. The policy core attributes of a government program in a specific jurisdiction will not be significantly revised as long as the subsystem advocacy coalition remains in power, except when change is imposed by a hierarchically superior jurisdiction. Advocacy coalitions. All that we have discussed thus far has led us to the introduction of advocacy coalitions. Advocacy coalitions are defined by actors who share policy core beliefs and who coordinate their actions in a non-trivial manner to influence a policy subsystem. There are 5 traditional hypotheses, though there is room for overlap in the hypothesis about advocacy coalitions that highlight some of the theoretical logic about coalitions and many of the most important concepts. Hypothesis 1 states that allies and opponents tend to be stable over time within a particular subsystem. This hypothesis has been heavily supported by evidence. While stability is generally present, coalition membership is less stable and subject to change. Hypothesis two is that actors within a subsystem will share core policy attributes of their coalition. This may differ with secondary attributes. This hypothesis has not resulted in many confirmations. Hypothesis three finds that coalitions prioritize the core aspect of their policy and are willing to recant secondary belief systems before acknowledging any possible weaknesses in the core. The authors note that this has not been sufficiently tested. Hypothesis 4 states that within a coalition, administrative agencies will usually advocate more moderate positions than their interest group allies. The authors need more testing and development in order to see how reliable it is in the real world of policy. Finally, Hypothesis 5 states that actors within purposive groups are more constrained in their expression of beliefs and policy positions than actors from material groups. This hypothesis too needs more development before being proven.